Hello, it's 10:30. We're ready to start the morning session, or the Friday session here in the main room. We have 3 presentations in the next hour and a half. And our first one is Chris Gavaler and Nathaniel Goldberg and their work on Tolkien's crossing of revisionary boundaries. Chris and Nathaniel are teachers at Washington Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. Chris is a philosopher, and Nathaniel is an Englisher. We're all Englishers.
Other direction.
Yes. Other way? I got it. I'm sorry. So one of them is a philosopher, and one of them is in English. So we'll see there. Let's welcome Chris and Nathaniel to Mythmoot.
Should we use these? Good morning, everyone. No, okay. Let's try it again. Good morning, everyone. Here we go. All right, so we're going to give a presentation about revision. This is a talk that's going to focus on philosophy of revision, which means it's going to be a subfield. There's going to be some terms that might be new to you, but I know after the first talk we heard this morning, I have no doubt that this is going to be actually comparatively simple.
All right, welcome. So we're going to start by introducing a couple of technical terms. Maybe you've heard of them, maybe you haven't, but just to facilitate our discussion. Let's call a discourse any published manuscript. And by contrast, let's call a diegesis a story constituted by a discourse when read. The difference being that different people can read the same discourse or book or manuscript and imagine entirely different worlds or different things about it. We'll call what they imagine, or the mental picture they develop, or the story that they construct, the diegesis. The discourse is the physical thing in front of them.
So just to clarify a little bit further, when you see words on paper, that's just ink. Ink on paper. It doesn't mean anything until you read it. So the ink on paper is just discourse. When you give it meaning by reading it, you create the diegesis. So that's the reader doing that with the words. And let me real quick. Oh,
go for it.
No, go ahead.
Me? All right, so we're going to look at 3 discourses that turn out to be multiple diegeses, and these should all be familiar.
Yeah.
First is the first edition of The Hobbit. Second is the second edition of The Hobbit, and we're ending at that point. I know there are several further ones, but life is short, and so is this talk. The third is The Lord of the Rings, and our point is going to be 3 separate physical objects, ink on paper or pixels on the screen, but as it turns out, multiple different stories depending upon how they're read in relation to one another.
So the term reboot, raise your hand if you're familiar with this term. Okay, I thought as much. Part of what we're doing here, Nathaniel and I, is taking common terms. Of course, we've got reboot here, retcon you'll look at a moment, and sequel we'll see in a couple minutes after that. These are common terms, but as we explored this, we discovered that despite their commonness, actually trying to define them is weirdly difficult, because when you get out there, there's all this overlap, use and I guess you can say misuse, but since there's not a standard definition for any of these terms, none of them are being misused, it's just like chaos. So a lot of what we're doing right here is just trying to give exact definitions to these terms, and we're using Tolkien because he does them all beautifully. So he's our sample here. So the origin of the term comes from 1970s rebooting a computer. In our first example, reading the 1951 edition of The Hobbit as rebooting the 1937 edition.
Right, assuming you've read only these 2 works, we're going to argue one natural way to read the second edition is as rebooting the first. And here, because I'm the nitty-gritty philosopher, here's what we think people mean by reboot. All right, sorry, here's a quote to show the reboot, and then what we think people mean. Alan, will you read that quote out loud? You've got a big booming voice.
Well, we'll see if it's still booming. Bilbo need not have been alarmed. For one thing, Gollum had learned long, long ago was never to cheat at the riddle game. Here's the passage, he whispered. Bilbo slipped under the arch and said goodbye.
And just to be clear, in that, a lot happens in that.
Yeah, that's a big ellipsis right
Okay,
there.
but the key is, well, next passage, please.
All right. In 1951, Bilbo felt he could not trust this slimy thing to keep any promise. Gollum grabbed as the hobbit flew over him, but too late. Bilbo sped off. There came a blood-curdling shriek filled with hatred and despair.
So using that as our example, we're going to give you a technical definition of what we think is going on. A reboot is a revision that a rebooting diegesis causes a rebooted one to undergo, where, and I'll talk through the example, this is a bit technical, but here we go. The earlier one, the 1937 edition, we'll call the rebooted one. The later one, the rebooting one. Here's the claim we're making. Forget Lord of the Rings, you're just reading these two books. Each of them is describing different characters, different events, different adventures, who of course have the same name, have an awful lot in common, but really if you're just presented with these two books, you can't reconcile them as both being true at the same time, bracketing the Lord of the Rings stuff. So it seems as if they're describing different worlds or diegetic worlds or different diegeses. But there's a special relationship between them. Namely, the later, the 1951 edition of The Hobbit, the second edition, awfully seems like it's similar, it's alluding to things that happened in the earlier edition, and readers who read both will get the sense that many of those experiences or details in the earlier edition, in the later edition, have already occurred, even though technically they're describing different people events in a different world. So there's an illusion, but not a relation of identity. And one way to test this is, at least my intuition is, because the worlds are different, characters in those worlds can't interact with one another. Bilbo in 1937, who has no reason to fear Gollum, guess what? Has no reason to fear him. So he can't talk to that Gollum who's slimy and who wants to eat him. They're in different worlds. And likewise, the Bilbo who's jumping over Gollum at the end of 1951 is not the Bilbo who's helped out of the cave by Gollum in 37. They're different characters. They don't interact with each other.
Okay, so that was reboot. Now we're looking at retcon. Now this is a slightly less familiar word. Raise your hand if you know retcon. Okay, should have guessed that. Good. Short for retroactive continuity. It's actually a term that originated from biblical scholarship around 1970, used much more in comics for a variety of, I won't go into those details. But retroactive continuity, and our example again, going back to Lord of the Rings, or rather Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings as a retconning of the 1937 edition of The Hobbit, not the 1954, but the 1937.
Right, so not to repeat the quote, remember what Alan said before, and can I pick on you, guy?
Sure.
Do one more?
All right, one more. This account Bilbo set down in his memoirs, and he seems never to have altered it himself. But many copies contain the true account as an alternative, derived no doubt from notes by Frodo and Samwise, both of whom learned the truth, though they seem to have been unwilling to delete anything actually written by the old Hobbit himself.
And so the truth in this case is the second edition that replaced the first edition. But of course, Tolkien knew that the 1930 copies of the first edition continued to exist. He very much would have liked to have eliminated them if he could have. He physically could not do that. And so, having rebooted, he then decided, I'm now going to retcon and find a way to bring 1937 into this same world. So it had been a separate world, that was his first move, and now he's bringing it into the same world.
Right, and given the same attempt at coming up with criteria, let's call a retcon any revision where a retconning diegesis causes a retcon one to undergo things in the following way. First, we'll again call the earlier one, the one published earlier, the retconned diegesis, the second one, the retconning. This time, however, they're referring to the same world. When we learn in Lord of the Rings that Bilbo lied about what happened when he met Gollum, that's the same Bilbo from 1937, whom Gandalf then later says lied. It's not a different one. Suddenly we're in the same diegesis, the same worldscape. But what we're doing is we're making it retroactively continuous, where the word retcon comes from, by reinterpreting the earlier events. And because we're reinterpreting the earlier events, the reader will read those earlier events not as having, an elusive relationship, but actually having occurred, but having been incorrectly presented. So retcon, it shows that something that happened before was wrong. Not different world, but incorrectly presented in the same world. And therefore, characters in the retconned and retconning diegeses world can be aware of one another. In fact, that's the whole point of the retcon. It's so that they know that what had happened before was in need of reinterpretation, because we're all playing with the same tools, we're all characters in the same reality.
And if I could just expand on this, number 3 is particularly important because this is a point that we went over a lot, Nathaniel and I, because a prequel is retroactively continuous, but a prequel does not reinterpret. So the key here is that something you find out after the fact, it's revealed, of course it's newly invented, but it's revealed that it was always this way, but we just didn't have enough context to understand what was really going on. That's retroactive. A prequel just fills in details but doesn't reinterpret anything. And this was like one of the trickiest things we had to figure out when trying to figure out how these terms work, because retcon, by its word, should simply be anything that's retroactively continuous, but that's not actually what's going on. It's much more specific. It has to be a reinterpretation.
Right, and if I may, so we originally wanted to call them sequels, and I think Chris called them that a minute ago, but then we realized that prequels also often function as just a continuation, merely one earlier in time, sequels after in time. Perhaps you know there are these things called interquels, books that are within a timeline. So we tried to come up with a general word for anything that expands a story, either earlier, in the middle, or after, and we came up with expansion. That's the origin of the term.
And the example we're looking at, of course, is reading The Lord of the Rings as expanding the 1951 edition of The Hobbit. Specifically the 1951, not the 1937 though, because that's been retconned in already.
Right, so perhaps I'll spare this time. Sean, do you want to read this one?
Sure. Say no more. It is plain enough what you are pointing at. Bilbo the silly hobbit started this affair, and Bilbo had better finish it, or himself.
Right, so Bilbo says this during the Council of Elrond, and we use this as a quote to show that it's the same story as the 1951 Bilbo. Bilbo finds the ring in the Hobbit, and then he winds up in Rivendell, and he volunteers to bring the ring to Mount Doom and have it destroyed. It's a continuation of the story, of course. Bilbo's not the one who does it, but it's the same characters, same object, and same history that unfolds. Okay, and once again, here's our attempt at trying to make that precise. As before, we'll call the earlier discourse, in this case the second edition of The Hobbit, the one that's expanded. The Lord of the Rings is the one that's expanding it. This time, again, they're referring to the same world, except, unlike before, there's no reinterpretation. Nothing is shown to have been incorrect. Instead, it's really shown to have been incomplete. The Hobbit, 1951, tells part of the story of the ring, its finding, doesn't tell the complete story, its destruction. And therefore, characters can be aware of each other in both parts of the story because they're the same characters, the same objects, just a continuation of the events. All right, so we started off by saying 3 discourses, multiple diegeses. Here's what they are. By our count, that first edition of The Hobbit is a rebooted diegesis and a retcon diegesis.
The 1951 edition is rebooting and expanded, and of course Lord of the Rings is both retconning and expanding. So again, if you recall when we began, we talked about a discourse simply being ink on paper. It's the reader interacting with the ink on paper, creating the diegeses that create, well, all of these. And here we have all 3 diagrammed together. Tolkien is doing, amazingly, all of these. And he's one of the few authors that actually, I mean, that's why we chose him. You can find examples of reboots. You can find many examples of expansions. You can find examples of retcons, but this, we were so pleased to see all 3 happening with the same author with the same text.
So just in conclusion, we'll tell you why we found this interesting and what we hope to do. So Chris and I are academics in different departments, and we were hoping to, in fact we have a draft of a book called that, and in that book, this is part of chapter 1, we're hoping to use Tolkien as an exemplar of different ways the texts can be revised. And if we're right, and that remains to be seen, but if we're right, these sort of revisionary patterns, rebooting, retconning, expanding, occur all over the literature, not just in fiction, but also in science, in history, and religion. Different texts can be seen as being read, as standing in these different relations towards one another. Final words?
We would love to.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Only if prose works. So that just made our lives simpler because it's such a complicated question. Before we limited ourselves that way, I think we more or less agreed, though we were still debating, those are reboots.
Yeah,
because
we're thinking they're
there's no
reboots.
way they can't be, because if there are details that are different, and inevitably there are going to be details that are different, it has to be a reboot. There's sort of no way around that.
I don't know. I mean, you could have many movies and adaptations of simplifications. Okay?
Simplifications?
Or simplifications, as opposed to expanding. I mean, they expand visually, but they tend to simplify in the story or the narrative. They focus on one thread, or they focus on fewer, and so you're dropping details. And I think that the stories may still be consistent, and they could be lived in both worlds, as you're saying. But as opposed to reboot, really, is you have a different story. I mean, a lot of adaptations, the stories end up being different, but again, I think it's a matter of degree as opposed to.
Yeah, this is the path we went down, trying to figure out, because, like, you take any work of literature, and anything that's in words, and you change medium, so that we were even just looking at illustration, like illustrated versions of The Hobbit. We looked at a whole bunch, and it's like, okay, what happens when all of the words are the same, 1937, it's a new edition, still 1937 words, but there's a new illustrator, and there's about 7 different sets of illustrations. Would each one of those be a reboot? And then it just started ballooning out of control, and we said, okay, let's only pay attention to words so we can do this. But I would, if the images are considered part of the diegesis, which means it's triggered both by words and images, then a different drawing of Bilbo must refer to a different Bilbo, and therefore must refer to a different world.
Well, maybe.
You've got different perceptions.
Right.
Two people can perceive the same thing differently. If somebody's colorblind and somebody's not colorblind, they see the same events. They just get different.
You're absolutely right. No, you're absolutely right. So the story, part one of the answer is you're right. This is way complicated. Part two of the answer is we wound up with this view that every reader has her own diegesis. We all speak a slightly different language. It just happens to overlap so expansively that we don't notice the difference. And that's degree differences between different adaptations. They're so microscopically different, but I guess we're committed to say that they may not be identical, but so close to being identical that for practical purposes, the scale of degree is insignificant.
So you're saying that is reader dependent?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and if you want, I can give you a whole 4 criterion logic showing you reader dependent. That's exactly what we're saying.
I'll wait you.
So, just taking this out of Tolkien for
Yes,
just a minute.
Exactly.
So if you have, for example, J.R.R. and Mrs. Rochester, those 2 novels, are you familiar with them?
J.R.R., I'm not familiar with Mrs. Rochester.
Okay, well, it's somebody who's written a novel telling the story from the point of view of Mrs. Rochester.
So like White Sargasso Sea, okay, I'm with you.
Yeah, so, kind of the same story, but is that an expansion? Is that a retcon?
It can be either. It gets tricky. And so the fact that it's by a different author isn't necessarily significant. Retconning usually happens when a new author takes over pre-existing story elements. That happens constantly in comic books where the word came from. So in that example, if the new author, almost every time the new author is going to do some retconning. The new authors tend to reinterpret things, but they don't necessarily have to. It could be pure expansion, both in the sequel sense of what comes next, and also filling in missing details that you don't know about, but don't reinterpret the world. So that could either be an expansion, or it could be a retcon. It's going to depend on individual cases.
So, speaking of an individual case,
Yeah.
how would the quest for Erebor, so that's Tolkien's retelling of the Hobbit story from the point
Right.
of view of the dwarves?
Right, so we'd have to evaluate in individual cases. One criterion for distinguishing, well, first I have to ask you the quest of Erebor in relation to which work? Because these are all relational properties,
Yeah,
right?
that's true, yeah.
Is it The Lord of the Rings you're asking, or is it The Hobbits?
Probably the Hobbit, yeah, in relation to the Hobbit.
So our quick test is, if there's a contradiction that's not reconciled, then it would be a reboot, because contradictions that are not reconciled, unless you're in a world that has contradictions, but I don't think Tolkien's worlds are meant to. Some things are meant just not to be explained, maybe, but not flat out contradictions. So one test of a reboot is if there are contradictions that just can't be reconciled, maybe that should be counted as they're in different spheres, different worlds, different secondary worlds, not the same secondary world.
I have a question about revisions. Like, I'm thinking about Baron and Luthien. I mean, Tolkien had 6 or 7 different versions of that, and some of them were published in 1954. Some of them were published in, was it 2016 or something like that? And then all of these versions have been published in the Histories of Middle-earth. Where does all that fit into? Does it have to be published in order to be kind of like on people's radar?
It's so interesting because everyone's bringing up the issues that we really grappled with. So because this is great. So what we decided arbitrarily, because you just simply have to make lines. So we said if it's published, it's a discourse. If it's not published, it has not become a discourse yet.
Okay.
So
Fair enough.
and then that gets really weird because you can have multiple versions of the same story, and what is your relationship to each other? Technically, they'd have to be reboots because they cannot be forced into the same world. And yet you see them as a group. So for a while we were playing with the term multiverse,
Right.
but that sent us down a rabbit hole. So we backed out of that. But we might go down that again at some point.
Well, and I would add, in regards to Baron and Luthien, if you look at the idea of the whole corpus of the history of Middle-earth being, I think Tolkien's idea that he didn't quite have time to realize was the idea of a textual tradition where the Book of Lost Tales would be a Mannish version of that story, and the Silmarillion would be an Elvish version of that story transmitted through men. And so they were all different versions of the same story, but they all existed in the same universe.
Yeah.
And so maybe that supports the idea that they're all reboots. But then in another sense, they're also sort of adaptations of the same story.
You just described a retcon. So that's what he did with the 1937 Hobbit. The story existed, and then he said, oh, Bilbo was lying about these details. This telling of the story, it didn't happen like that, but the telling happened, and so we can incorporate that. So that's what's happening there. It's like, oh, these are different versions of the same story. They all exist. Some of them may be more true than others, but they all exist in this world. So that's a way of retconning them in together, saying we don't necessarily know which ones are true, but we know the stories are all exist here. So that's a perfect example of retcon.
Yeah, and if I could add, one complication that we left out here, because time is short and all that, in a way, The Lord of the Rings not only retcons the 1937 edition of The Hobbit, it retcons the reboot away. So when you read Lord of the Rings, the reboot disappears because both stories now appear. That's just an added complication that...
So there had been another world.
Yeah, but now it turns out it's a version of this one.
Right.
They merged.
Yeah.
And it might even be that it's pretty common, maybe, for there to be clusters of these revisions within one another, where one revision swallows another.
Yeah, it's extremely common in comics.
How do you consider a prose and a poetry version of the same story?
It depends. So you've got a different discourse. This is interesting. So can two discourses create the same diegesis? That's another way of posing that.
Yeah.
Are both versions, two tellings, referring to the same world and the same events without any contradiction? So that depends. So you can have a totally different set of words, and as long as they don't create any diegetic contradiction, you're looking at the same thing.
But if I interpret them slightly differently and I focus on different details, but it's the same.
Yeah.
But it's the same story. I just focus on different things.
Right. But the different things you focus on, if there's no contradiction, then it's the same world, and you're looking at just simply two tellings of the same story world. If there's a contradiction in what you focus on, you've got two worlds and therefore reboots.
Translation. So.
Yeah, actually, I think this one's straightforward. So I was, well, so far as anything is. So I was going to say, I was understanding the prose poetry model as one of translation. It's like reading the same thing in Akkadian or Sumerian, right, from the talk earlier. Well, I know, but, right, so then, yeah, so one thing is we can say everything is in a way a translation, and just understand as long as there's no contradiction, they can refer to the same things in different words or different forms.
Which is actually very, very common. So it's like if you open up a newspaper, you read the New York Times or the Washington Post, and they refer to the same event. There are two tellings of the same event. If you watch Fox News, there are contradictions, so maybe there are reboots. But the idea of two tellings of the same event is actually wildly common. It's the norm, really.
But in the case of a newspaper, you're dealing with a factual event that is being referred, as opposed to two translations of the Odyssey, which you're talking about.
Right, but in both cases, you're dealing with, or at least this is how our whole analysis builds on the idea of there are worlds.
Yeah.
Ours happens to be actual, but there are also merely possible worlds, but they're just as much worlds as ours. Ours is also a possible world. It's not merely possible, it's also actual. But with this idea of just thinking about worlds, yeah, we're two stories or two tellings referring to the same world, no problem.
And if you want a quick example of fact, right, the second word in our title, we have been arguing that the normal progress of science, scientific discoveries, everyday lab work, that involves expanding, or diegesis, expanding our knowledge base. A scientific revolution, however, might be a retcon. It might be where you have to reinterpret things you've already discovered in light of something else.
So one of the examples we've been looking at is what Einstein did to Newton. Now, if you read a textbook, the textbook will tell you, in different words, this is merely an expansion. Einstein built on Newton, there's no contradiction. If you actually go back to Newton, there's huge contradiction. So the textbook retcons Newton into Einstein as if there's no contradiction at all. So these changes disappear because Newton defined mass in a way that completely contradicts how Einstein defined it. You can't actually make them work together, but common knowledge is, oh yeah, Einstein just built on Newton. It's no problem. Actually, it's a huge problem, but it's been retconned out of existence.
Thank you, everybody.